Good morning, everyone. We're going to start off our first session for today. Joining us from the United States, Brandon Blewett. He is the audio director at Wargaming Chicago, Baltimore. He is developing World of Tanks on console. He's also has experience over 20 years at being a sound engineer for concerts in Chicago and around the US. So please give a warm welcome to Brandon.
Thank you, everybody, for coming this morning. I know sound people aren't really known for getting up early. We usually work late. I'm Brendan. I am the audio director of Wargaming Chicago, Baltimore. Thank you for having me here in Russia. It's always an amazing experience to come so far and see so many amazing new people and experience such an incredibly rich culture. Quick background on me. I've been working on games for the last 12 years. I've covered the gamut of game types. I've worked on everything from America's Army for the US Department of Defense to the Avengers Initiative for Marvel and Disney, to Dora the Explorer for Nickelodeon, to Harvey Birdman, attorney at law for Cartoon Network. I started playing music when I was about 15 years old in the suburbs of Chicago, harvesting whatever kind of random music equipment I could from resale shops or parents that played guitar or whatever. And I've been tinkering with sound or recording sound or manipulating sound in some capacity for the last 20 or 22 years or so. I've worked with a gazillion bands probably over the years. I've been doing live sound, locally as a child. I went to university at the California Institute of the Arts where I got to do live sound for world music productions, Roy Disney Music Hall, the Sharon Disney Lund Theater. I've just worked with a lot of varieties of things from gamelan ensembles to heavy metal bands. In Chicago, I am a resident sound engineer at a concert venue on the south side, and I've gotten to work with acts there like King's X, Dillinger Escape Plan, Voodoo Glow Skulls. I've done front of house for Marty Friedman from Megadeth, Dave Ellefson from Megadeth. I've worked with members of Anthrax. I've done a lot of different metal show sounds. I've just been very active in sound for my whole life. I've shipped loads of games, like I said, so there's this kind of weird confluence of live sound and games that I've worked on. And in recent years, I've been working for Wargaming, so I'm working in live games now as well. And you might wonder, what is it about games that has anything to do with concerts, right? What do concerts and games have in common? Because they are different formats of entertainment. People gather as a group to go see concerts. Generally, people play games alone, but maybe as a group online. What does it all mean? I was originally going to talk about sound effects recording and how I put those into the into the game, but I feel that's kind of a subject that's been covered before, so I wanted to get a little bit more philosophical and talk about what we can learn from concerts and bring into the world of mixing games. When you think about it, some similarities start to occur when you really focus on what it is that we do as game sound designers or live sound engineers. Both disciplines are the only disciplines within the audio world that focus on the reinforcement of human performances in real time. Let's talk about the low-level functional roles really quick about what you do as a game sound designer versus what you do as a live sound engineer, just to get everybody on the same page. As a game sound designer, you have to provide information to the player that reinforces their performance as a player. You have to give them feedback about whether or not they're taking damage or dealing damage, or whether or not they're running low on a resource of some some type. We get to manipulate sounds to determine how that information is delivered. We do that through processing of recordings or synthesis. We get to sculpt that information into an auditory experience that means something to the player. And then we mix it in a way that entertains the player as well. It has to be rewarding in some way. Like the concept of the cha-ching every time you pull the arm on the slot machine, the player wants to be rewarded. It's Pavlovian. Live sound engineers present entertainment to an audience, but something that a lot of people aren't aware of because it's such a behind-the-scenes thing. If you go to a concert and enjoy it, you're usually thinking more about the musicians on stage, their personas, their performance, not about the behind-the-scenes guys that are kind of presenting it to you. One of the most critical parts of live sound is the monitor mix for on-stage players. And if you're not a musician, you've probably noticed at concerts that there are an array of speakers on the floor in front of the player. They're called monitors. Each one of those speakers or zones on the stage is dialed in to provide a unique mix to each player to enable them to play better as an individual as well as play better as a group. As a front of house or monitor engineer, you get to select microphones, you get to dial in equalization, dynamics processing, effects, to present it in a way that's satisfying and directional in the way that it presents the information to both the player on stage and the audience. And then lastly, you get to manipulate their performance to present to the audience and entertain them. So you get to accentuate the best parts of the performance while kind of maybe suppressing the weaker parts of the performance. And the word feedback also, I wanted to be clear. If there are any live sound engineers out there or anyone that has experience, I'm talking about informational feedback, not sound feedback, not the ee that comes out of the speakers when something's gone horribly wrong. So, the live sound engineer works with the player to provide information about the performance, plus entertainment to the audience. The game sound designer works with the player to provide information about the performance, plus entertainment to the player. So here, the word player, whether you're playing guitar or playing a game, becomes interchangeable for a music performance or feedback via informational sound in a game setting. Therefore, the game player is both the performer and the audience. So now that these roles have been defined, and we've identified this overlap where we provide information to players so that they can play better, as well as entertain the player who is also the performer, or who is also the audience in the instance of games, we have to begin to address the challenge of delivering both entertainment and information to a player who is also the audience. Runtime during a game and showtime during a concert are the same thing, in that they are both unpredictable. Even with the same players and the same instruments through the same amps, every day each performance is different. And in World of Tanks, for instance, you might use the same tank for 4 games in a row, but the auditory experience is going to be different every time because of the fact that you're playing as a group. It's dynamic. The sound can change at any time, depending on player input or variation in performance in the instance of music. It's non-iterative. And I really want to press this one home. This is one of the main components that really, really ties live sound and live games together, is that it's the only discipline within audio where we can't rewind. We can't rewind and listen to what happened and change it. There's only one direction, and it's forward. Now, you could record a game and go back potentially and remix it if you've captured audio events, through a Wise log or something like that, and change it that way. But when it comes to the live game out in the world, people are playing it, you can never go back to change anything. So when you approach these mixing strategies, you have to be prepared to not be able to go back. It's always forward. Live concerts are the same thing. Hopefully you've never been to a concert where a band stops in the middle of the song and then starts over because they screwed something up. They're both widely varied in timbre. So if it's a Marshall full stack, or a flute, or an accordion, or birds chirping, or explosions, or tanks, there's a huge wide variety of sound sources that you have to deal with in every instance. In the live world, no 2 days are the same. In the game world, no 2 matches are the same. It's our responsibility as mixing engineers to consistently deliver feedback and entertainment in an eternally inconsistent environment. Now, if you're a sound engineer at a club, or if you're a sound engineer working with a band that's on tour, you're either going to be working with a different artist every day, or you're going to be working on a different sound system or room every day. It's always different, so you have to be able to adapt. And there's the big one. Your work goes unnoticed unless you screw something up. Whether it's a game or a concert, if the audience is happy and doesn't mention the sound, it means that you're doing it right. So in this instance, no news is good news. Now, this next slide is kind of a huge info dump. It's a signal path of a rock concert for the front of house. And I'm not expecting you to fully understand what's going on here at this time, but if you break this down into individual components, it starts to make sense. So check out the slide after the talk if you get a chance. But each of the items at the top is an input. Kick drum, snare drum, hi-hats, toms, cymbals, bass, guitar, keyboards, vocals. We manipulate each of these channels to present the most appealing parts of those instruments. Listening to it in a room doesn't sound good, but once you put a microphone on it, you can really manipulate the sound. So we add gain stages, we add effects, we add equalization, we add panning. You can use selective use of dynamics processing. It allows you to shape the mix to accentuate the most entertaining parts. Drums and vocals are always the star of the show if it's a rock show. So we get to manipulate that using mixing consoles or audio processors. Now, the other side of the coin is the monitor mix. This is a stage plot of a rock band. You can see the drummer is up top here. And then the front of stage performers are here, the audience is here. Each one of these mixes, the blue boxes, are an individual mix for each player. It provides information to the player based on their position or their role in the band. Now, this is where things get kind of interesting, because each player wants to hear something different. They want to hear themselves, they want to hear the other players, but they want to hear themselves more than the other players. And some of them need to hear certain other players within the band to enhance their own performance. So the singer needs to hear the guitar so that he can harmonize with it. If you abstract this concept of individual players, whether it's a guitar player or a bass player or a drummer, you can translate this into the game world and say, this is a wizard, this is a thief, this is a dwarf, or perhaps this is an artillery unit, this is a heavy tank, this is a light tank. Each of these units or players needs to have their own unique information presented to them. So here's how I would suggest for a band to mix their stage mix. For instance, the drummer does not need to hear any vocals. The singer is flawed. The singer is never going to keep time. The drummer's job is to keep time, so he should focus on that. The point is that when each player gets a selective mix of information, it enables them to both perform as individuals as well as perform better as a group. Mixing these monitor mixes individually allows spectrally focused information to be delivered to each individual player. Now, I'm going to get back to the game world here and talk about how this kind of plays out in a real game environment. This is a rough representation of World of Tanks console output structure. There are certain instances here where there's data being driven by signal levels. Like for voiceover, for instance, generates floating point data that I can use downstream to manipulate the mix on other sounds. Below that, there's explosions and ballistics that gives me numerical data to manipulate other parts of the mix. Simplifying this output structure basically means that voiceover stomps everything below it. Guns and ballistics stomp all the world sounds. So anytime any one of these important events happens, it drops the volume of all the other sounds. And this allows that vital information to get to the player clearly without cluttering up the mix. Now, the fact that in the instance of a Wise meter plugin, the fact that it's generating floating point data means that we can manipulate anything with it. It doesn't have to be volume. In my example here, I'm using volume, but there's a lot of creative territory that hasn't been explored where we can manipulate low-pass filter, high-pass filter, notch filtering, equalization, or effects sense, effects parameters. And obviously, World of Tanks is a game that's set in a real-world environment. But if you're doing something more abstract, like a puzzle game, perhaps you can manipulate audio with effects to present it, to change the way that this information is being presented. So the fact that it's so data-driven and we have access to these values is pretty cool. It gives you a lot of power. So each game player gets a selective mix of information vital to the success of their performance. It lets them play as individuals as well as a group in a live scenario, right? In our game, we've determined these to be the most important informational items that get to the player. It gives them direct feedback about how they're doing and about how their teammates are doing. The less important item, not less important, but non-informational sounds are music, natural ambience, destructible battle, or destructible objects, distant battle, things that are filling in the space. They're giving you a sense of space, but this is giving you information. Again, these are the things that we want to create spectral focus on. We want to be able to focus on these sounds. So I have a video to show real quick, and it's just a quick capture that I got from Xbox from a dev build playing against bots. So this is not a very good example of gameplay, but it's a good example of how the game adapts to the player and what's happening in the game. So listen to this as it plays forward, and notice that once combat begins, that the tank sounds start to drop in volume. The natural ambience around the world drops. And as soon as you start taking damage, the explosions drop. Voiceover events come in. Everything kind of dynamically mixes, and it adjusts to what's happening in the game to provide the player with the information they need to know to succeed at playing. More volume, please. Even more volume, please.
They've spotted us! We pierced their armor! Enemies looking right at us! They hit one of our tracks! They finished him off! Throwing up the camo net. That's gotta hurt! Penetration! Frag hit! Enemy vehicle destroyed!
So in this instance, we can hear how basically there's a loud mix that starts to change priorities as things happen. As the gameplay continues, several sounds get to trade off being the loudest sound. So the whole mix ends up sounding loud, but the vital information ends up getting through. It doesn't get lost. And in a non-deterministic environment, we have to use this dynamic approach because we don't know what's going to happen. If it was a movie, we'd be able to look at the script, talk to the director, work with the editor to dial in the mix because we can rewind and iterate. But in this instance, you're only going forward. So using that numerical data to control the mix is, in my opinion, the best approach to deal with this unpredictability. So, when approaching your project and identifying where sounds are needed, it might pay to separate your sounds into two different categories, for informational sound and non-informational sound. Consider post-processing of sounds to reflect whether or not the sound is intended to provide direct information to the player, or is it just supposed to be entertaining to them? As sound engineers, we get to create a method to provide that focus, right? Whether it's through volume manipulation, equalization, or effects. Realism goes out the window when you're trying to provide information. And this rings true for both live sound, games, and films. A scene in the film Fury comes to mind where Brad Pitt is standing on his tank talking to the gunner who's blasting a .50 caliber machine gun. And he's having a conversation with the guy. In real life, they'd be both suffering permanent hearing damage and would be like, I can't understand what you're saying. They wouldn't be able to hear each other. But for the sake of information to the audience, they determined that, all right, we're going to actually drop the volume of the .50 caliber machine gun in this scene so that Brad Pitt can have a conversation with his friend. When it comes to entertainment, you want everything to be as huge and bombastic as possible. So keep your mix loud. I mean, that's just kind of the name of the game. Unless you're doing a horror game, loud sounds are good, especially when it comes to World of Tanks. That's an interesting challenge that I have because unless your engine's broken, which is a very small fraction of gameplay, there's always a tank engine screaming. And if you've ever been around construction equipment, that's about how loud it is. It's cacophonous. You should wear hearing protection if you're just riding around in a tank, much less firing a main gun. So, what does it all mean? A live game is a concert of players. Our job as game sound designers is to do both monitors and front of house for the player. Successful monitor mixes let players play together better. Successful front of house mixes entertain everybody, including non-players. And our challenge as developers is to seamlessly interpolate between monitors and front of house for each player, based on their character, unit type, and activities in game. So ultimately, these strategies of using side chaining and ducking to manipulate volume or other parameters is all about seamlessly transitioning between information and entertainment. So the future of game audio may well be furthering the exploitation of these principles. With increased voice counts, DSP capabilities, our ability to carve out channels for information to flow through in our mixes will only continue to grow. Convolution reverbs, spatialization, dynamic processing, the more that we can layer this on and the more that we can manipulate the sound to create these channels will create new aural experiences that transcend these old school clunky techniques of just saying we're going to tie a sound to an event. Curating the information that's presented to the player through adaptive and flexible data-driven processes is the name of the game. That's all I've got. Thank you. Do you guys have any questions, comments, challenges? Yes, sir.
Are you exclusively using meters for all your ducking or the traditional
Yes,
ducking?
at this time I'm exclusively using meters. I haven't turned on HDR yet, but the fact that the meter just generates a float that I can control any parameter with seems like the simple way to go. Anyone else?
Do you think there's room for, say, player customization of the oral experience on their end to help them, optimize their gameplay based on their game style, like play style that they've adopted?
That's a really good question. And there's like, how much should you expose to the player, right? That's a big question. And obviously, in the PC realm, that's a whole different beast because of mods. In the console realm, where we work, exposing that via user interface might improve player experience, but ultimately it's just giving them control of something that they're going to break, possibly. So it's tough to say. Can you trust people with it?
I guess the question is do you feel like the mix that you're giving the player is kind of like intrinsic to the game's experience, the game's brand, or is that something that you think would be interesting to put in the hands of the players? It's more of like a philosophical question.
Right. Yeah, and it's a good question. It's like, should you allow them to change the experience from the curated professional version that's presented? And I don't see a problem with that. In the instance of data-driven changes based on metering, in this instance, that could change the experience entirely and kind of break that informational channel that gets created by volume. So in World of Tanks console, if you turn the voiceover volume down in the UI options, it stops triggering that sidechain. So the VO can get buried a lot easier. Not only is it not as loud, but it's also not ducking the other sounds now. So in that approach, using HDR would fix that because that's more event-driven versus audio-driven. But it's a complicated topic, and I'm all about giving people options. I just don't want to give people options and then have them break it and complain that it doesn't sound right anymore.
In a live situation, you're going to have, let's say you're the keyboard player in the band. You're going to be able to talk to your monitor guy and say, man, I can't hear the singer. I need you to pump his vocals up. No game player is going to say, hey, I need to contact Brendan because I'm not hearing this thing. And they may not even know they're hearing it. How do you deal with feedback on whether you need to change an existing mix, and how often are you able to push up like patches and things to actually tweak as you go along in the game?
Well, in World of Tanks, it's excellent because we release a patch every 6 weeks or so. So I actually have pretty awesome control over how I can change the mix. And that's a topic that I could actually get into way more in depth, how to change your mix, because once you've released a game, people have expectations. And even if you're objectively changing it for the better, people hate change, so they turn on you really quick. But making decisions based on analytics or focus groups is a good start, and incremental changes over a long period of time is the other element that you need to focus on. And if you ever remix a game, be prepared for backlash, even if it sounds 10 times better. And I'm telling you this from personal experience. Anyone else?
I have a question of my own.
Yes.
I was wondering, is there like a limit input that you get? Is there any priorities that you have, like for like enemy tanks versus nearby fellow tanks? Like, do you work with that?
Yes. So I can go back to, where is this slide? The prioritization one, the output structure. Here. So we route player tanks and non-player tanks through separate buses, and those are manipulated separately by that numerical data. So it's entirely based on groups of sounds. And each, it's more complicated than this, the actual output structure, but this is kind of the simplified version. I use buses to control all this stuff, as opposed to doing it at like a lower level. It's just an output group. And I kind of use Wise like it's a big front of house console at a concert venue. There's more kind of computer sciencey ways to use it, but I like the concept of it being audio driven as well as data driven. So we can extract data from the audio and manipulate other audio that way versus just controlling all the audio like ham-fistedly with game data. Now there is game data controlling things like whether or not your engine's underwater or not. But ultimately, I like the idea of the player's experience controlling the mix. Like the first-person player, as the player.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, there's nothing else. Thank you, guys.
We have many great people here at 4C today, and here's one of them. Hi, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Alexander Markovic. I am Creative Director at Ministry of Games, and I'm here to talk about city building games and design principles of those.
Nice. Do you remember your very first video game that you've played?
Sure, it was The Prince of Persia back in something like 89 or whatever it would have been. Yes.
It's a great game back in the day and still. What's your favorite game of all time today?
I guess I like mobile games, so at the moment I think my favorite game would be probably something like Brawl Stars or Clash Royale, so Supercell PvP titles, or on the other hand some city building titles like Township.
What do you think about the state of modern video game industry overall?
Well, I guess there is a lot happening at the moment, which is awesome. The core games are doing awesome stuff, the casual games are doing awesome stuff, so I think it is awesome that inclusion is happening on all sides, right?
Anything that maybe irritates or saddens you, something that you don't like in the state of game dev today?
Well, the only thing that might sadden us is that sometimes there is a bit of lack of inclusion happening, and sometimes there is a certain amount of kind of toxic behavior that occurs in the gaming circles. But other than that, I think it is just moving in the awesome direction.
Well, it is moving in an awesome direction, and we're here to try and foresee it. Speaking of which, what do you see happening in the industry in like a 10 years' time? What will be the new thing, the new trend, do you think?
Well, hopefully the mobile games stay relevant, right? But other than that, obviously AR and geolocation games are super interesting, and stuff that's happening with that is super exciting, and also hopefully as things move forward, we get more inclusive or like more engaged worlds that we kind of play together with each other. And I think this is something that we're hopefully moving towards too.
Well, you're part of the industry, you can help move it forward. Speaking of which, how did you end up in the industry? How did you come here?
Well, I guess as anyone else, I just kind of liked the whole idea of the escapism of the games that was offered to us as we were young, and I just kind of stick with them throughout my youth, and it was a logical choice growing older, right?
What's more important for you in games that you like graphics, storytelling, the gameplay, or maybe a combination?
I guess in the end, for me, it comes back to the community and kind of the shared experience of playing the games. So it is in the end about kind of multiplayer of it.
What about the single-player games then?
Which are also awesome. There is nothing about games that is not awesome, right? So single-player games also cool. Whatever story-driven RPGs, story-driven text adventure games. There is nothing to dislike in those either, but for me, just kind of the multiplayer experience is something that drives the medium forward into kind of this new, less explored areas of just kind of playing with your, children or with your parents or with your grandparents. Why not? And I guess this is something that just excites me.
So the future is in multiplayer and socializing in games. Is that right for you?
Well, I hope it is I guess what I'm saying.
Well, we can move it over there. St. Pete, we're here today. What do you think about the city?
A beautiful city, repeat. So awesome times to be had all around, and I'm glad to be here. Thankful for the opportunity.
Glad to have you here. Also surprised you know the cult song about St. Pete. What about the conference? I know it's the first day, but what are your impressions so far? Maybe expectations?
Well, I've met some awesome people all around. I'm looking forward to hearing their talks, to hearing their thoughts on the future of gaming and the future of the industry, and have high hopes.
Any specific speech you're maybe looking forward to? Somebody you want to listen to?
So there is, for example, the Greg Street, the design director of League of Legends, will be talking about using user feedback to improve your game design. So this is something that, for example, I'm very interested in. And also anything from game design track is something that appeals to me very much.
Well, hope you find it useful. And finally, if you were standing here in my place interviewing yourself, what question would you ask yourself?
Whoa, not sure at all.
I guess you have all the answers then. Yeah, possibly. Well, I hope you find more answers here on 4C, and thank you very much, and have a nice time.
Thank you.
So we've prepared a few questions for one of our speakers. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Ville Rauma from Fingersoft, Finland. So, yeah, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Please tell me, what's the first game you have ever played, the video game?
I think that would probably be maybe Microsoft Flight Simulator 3. And
it was your very first, right?
Yeah.
All right. Which one is your favorite today?
Right now, basically, Divinity Original Sin 2 is like really awesome.
It's amazing. I gotta agree with you there. And what led you to the gaming industry? How did you start?
Well, basically, I was studying in University of Oulu, and we had a training period where you go to a company, and there happened to be a game company in the list where you can pick where you want to go, and I was like, yeah, I want to go there. So that's how I got started.
So they just took you in?
Yeah, because it's like the companies kind of volunteer that we'll take trainees from the university, so you can kind of pick where you want to go. So yeah.
Sounds great. So what is your favorite thing about the video game industry today?
Well, I don't know. It's like it's really hectic, and it's quite kind of free kind of environment where people can really be, you know, who they are, and it's kind of laid back. So I think that's pretty cool.
It generally is, but are there maybe things that make you mad or sad in the today's state of gaming industry?
Well, I don't know, like, it's difficult to say. Sometimes there are things, but nothing pops to mind right now. Like, maybe sometimes, like, they, especially like huge studios kind of focus on single thing. You know how it is, like sometimes there's only World War II games, and next you have only like future mech games or whatever. So it's like always these big trends and less about like innovation and new type of games. So maybe that.
Speaking of trends, do you see any trend surfacing in 10 years or so? How do you view the gaming industry in the nearest future?
Well, long term, like 10 years, I think probably yeah, there's gonna be big changes. Like of course VR, AR are big, but right now they're like really new stuff, so it's not really like a big business opportunity right now, but that's probably going to be big in the future. I think it's going to take a few years, but yeah, at least that.
So you feel like technologies are going to be the game changer here?
Well, at least with VR and AR, I feel like the experience is so awesome that when you do that, everybody who tries it thinks it's awesome, but right now it's just too cumbersome and complicated to do, so I think that's the biggest issue there. But yeah, also of course there's gonna be probably like different trends in the way games, like the kind of like the free-to-play model right now, how it is, probably will change. It's always changing. So yeah.
That's true. But speaking experiences, what do you think is more important in a game? Like the age-old question: is it graphics? Is it the gameplay? The storytelling?
Gameplay, of course. Yeah.
The simplest question of all. Okay, so what do you think about St. Petersburg?
I love it so far. It's first time actually for me in Russia and in St. Petersburg. So yeah.
And what about the conference?
Yeah, it's looking really awesome. It's like well organized, so I like it.
What was the best question you were asked so far?
I don't know which game you are playing right now, of course, because I'm waiting to go back home so I can continue playing.
I completely understand you there. Which question would you ask yourself if you were interviewing yourself?
Oh, that's a hard one. You know, what's going to be your next game? And I couldn't answer right now because we are working on a lot of prototypes and we'll see what it's going to be. But yeah.
Great. Are you looking forward to any specific presentation? Which do you want to listen to most?
Yeah, I did mark a few. I don't remember the titles right now, but they were like interesting because there's a lot of like really cool people here who know like a lot about a lot of things. So yeah. I think for me, maybe on the kind of leadership business track is maybe the most kind of interesting for me right now because that's my job. So, yeah.
Well, you're one of the cool people here, so thank you for coming and thank you for being a part of this.